The era of the Vikings. In modern popular culture, the image of the Viking is perhaps no longer unfamiliar, thanks to a series of works including films, television shows, and even manga. However, this popularity itself stems from a highly remarkable period in European history, in particular, and world history in general, a period even named after the Vikings. The term Viking refers to the explorers, merchants, warriors, and pirates who hailed from the Scandinavian peninsula. One important distinction must be made. Although the Vikings were part of the Norse peoples, not every Norseman was considered a Viking. In practice, when referring to the Vikings and the Scandinavian peninsula, people primarily mean those belonging to kingdoms such as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The term Viking first appeared in an ancient 9th century Anglo-Saxon poem. Additionally, the word is found on runestones, carved with a person's name and the deeds they accomplished during their lifetime. The origin of this word is quite obscure. It may derive from the Old Norse word vikingur, or its Old English equivalent. The term might share a linguistic root with vik, meaning a small bay or inlet, thus referring to those who shared a boat to a cove, or people from Viken in the Oslo Fjord region of Norway. In addition, the term Viking could also refer to the act of overseas expeditions by ship. According to the Norwegian-Danish author and historian Ludvig Holberg, Viking was synonymous with a plunderer or highwayman. Meanwhile, another Danish historian, L.S. Raven, suggested that in the West Norse dialect of Old Norse, Viking roughly translated to a sea warrior, pirate, or seafarer. Overall, the term did not apply to all Norse peoples, but was primarily used to denote a specific group of merchants, raiders, or mercenaries at sea. It can be said that the word did not carry the same meaning back then as it does today. Furthermore, continental Europeans rarely called them Vikings. For instance, the Franks referred to them as Northmen or Normans, meaning men of the north. The Slavs called them the Rus or Varangians, referring to the Varangian tribes coming from the east. The Arabs called them Majus, while the Irish generally referred to them as pagans or simply foreigners. In our contemporary culture, Vikings are often depicted as brutal, somewhat barbaric warriors with terrifying customs. Although this portrayal is partially based on reality, it inadvertently creates the impression that they were merely mindless brutes, obsessed with chaotic fighting, killing, and looting. In reality, the truth was quite the opposite. As Viking society was highly organized, they possessed a culturally rich heritage, consisting of skilled farmers, accomplished merchants, and, above all, master navigators. Over several centuries, the Vikings left an indelible mark across almost the entire Western world as they continuously set sail to expand their power and influence. What, then, were the driving forces behind their expansion? Regarding the causes of the Viking expansion, there are currently 4 primary hypotheses. Demographics. A population boom is often viewed as one of the main drivers forcing the Vikings to migrate to the warmer south. Through deeper research, historians suggest that agricultural development, aided by new types of tools, contributed to rapid population growth. This led to a shortage of arable land and a lack of available work. Consequently, more and more people were forced to seek opportunities in foreign lands. Economics. During the 7th and 8th centuries, Europe began to recover from the fall of the Western Roman Empire, entering a phase of renewed trade and urbanization. A series of relatively bustling urban centers along the coastal areas of northern Europe became prime targets for the Vikings. The success of early raiding voyages also motivated Viking leaders to organize larger and more prolonged expeditions. Gradually, their objectives expanded to include capturing slaves and seizing land. Religion and ideology. The rapid rise and expansion of Islam, alongside conflicts involving Christianity, both being monotheistic religions, had a certain impact on the polytheistic beliefs of the Vikings. Furthermore, their devotion to the Norse gods was exceptionally strong, driving Viking warriors to fight with relentless, do-or-die determination. Norse mythology emphasized that a true warrior who died in battle would be welcomed into Valhalla, the grand hall of the gods. If a Viking warrior died of old age or in a sickbed, their soul would be relegated to hell, a cold and dark underworld. A true warrior dreaded this second death. Thus, they always sought to fight with courageous spirits, and expansionist raids provided the ideal opportunity to seek a glorious death on the battlefield. Additionally, internal political disputes within the Scandinavian peninsula forced many deposed Viking nobles to seek their fortunes in southern lands. Environment breakthroughs in maritime technology made long-distance voyages far more efficient for the Vikings. During this period, the climate also became milder and more favorable, establishing an ideal foundation for their military adventures. Viking culture and social structure were generally quite straightforward. Divided into three main classes: thralls, slaves, carls free commoners, and jarls nobles. Thralls occupied the lowest social rung, accounting for approximately 1/4 of the Viking population. Slavery played an extremely vital role in Viking society, as slaves performed daily chores, provided labor for construction, and served as a crucial link in economic trade. Consequently, one of the primary objectives of Viking raids and invasions was to capture as many slaves as possible. As the lowest class, thralls were generally looked down upon and received harsh treatment in Viking society. The free commoners, or carls, made up the majority of the Viking population. They held the rights to own land, farms, fields, and livestock. Most free Vikings worked as farmers or craftsmen, while a minority became merchants. They possessed certain rights and were permitted to participate and voice their opinions to some extent in political assemblies. Nevertheless, actual power and decision-making authority remained firmly in the hands of the nobility. The ruling class in Viking society consisted of the jarls. They were the wealthiest class, owning vast estates, numerous livestock, and many slaves, while also claiming the lion's share of spoils from raids. Their responsibilities were to lead and protect their lands and people. They were also the ones who organized raids, exploratory expeditions, and wars of invasion. Much like most of Europe during that era, Viking society was patriarchal. Viking women held no political power and were expected to defer to the men in their families. However, compared to their contemporaries in other European nations, Viking women enjoyed greater freedom and independence. They had the right to inherit a portion of property upon their husband's death. In some rare cases, Viking women even held leadership positions if their husbands passed away without leaving any children or brothers. Although many popular culture works depict Viking women as formidable shield maidens or warriors, such instances were historically very rare. A defining characteristic of Viking culture was their runic alphabet. This system of writing, which utilized only straight and diagonal lines to facilitate carving on stone, consisted of 24 characters. Furthermore, Runic letters were used in magical rituals and divination. A significant number of rune stones remain preserved today in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. They serve as invaluable historical sources for understanding the cultural and spiritual lives of the ancient Vikings before they were influenced by Christianity. As a maritime warrior culture, the Vikings were exceptionally passionate about warfare. The weapons and gear they deployed in battle were highly diverse, including axes, swords, spears, bows, and armor. A typical Viking warrior's kit consisted of an iron axe or spear, a round shield, chainmail armor, and an iron helmet with a nasal guard. Commanders and high-ranking nobles would additionally carry long swords and wear superior quality armor. The Vikings fought most effectively aboard their longships or as infantry. Generally, due to geographical constraints and their combat style, the Vikings virtually lacked cavalry. While they did ride horses, it was almost exclusively for reconnaissance and scouting, rather than active battlefield combat. When discussing Viking warriors, one cannot overlook their iconic, highly versatile longships. Viking warships typically featured long, narrow hulls, allowing them to operate with ease on both open seas and shallow rivers. Thanks to their lightweight and flexible design, these vessels could travel at impressive speeds. They could cover nearly 300 kilometers in a single day if the winds were favorable. A medium-sized warship could carry from 25 to 30 men, ideal for swift raids and looting. For large-scale invasions, larger longships could transport from 50 to 60 men. The unique design of the Viking longship also allowed them to beach directly onto land without needing a harbor. This advantage enabled them to strike and withdraw rapidly before the enemy could mount a response. This tactic gave them a tremendous edge, as defenders could not maintain tight defenses everywhere at all times. The unstable political climates in several European nations, particularly England and France, further allowed the Vikings to reap substantial benefits. By the mid-9th century, Viking raids, plunder, and invasions grew increasingly frequent. The event traditionally used to mark the beginning of the Viking Age was the raid on the monastery on the island of Lindisfarne off the coast of England in 793. The Vikings made an unexpected landing on the island on June 8, 793, catching the local monks completely off guard. The onslaught was incredibly brutal. About 50 monks were slaughtered or thrown into the sea to drown. Many others were enslaved, and the wealth within the monastery was entirely plundered. The sacking of the monastery on Lindisfarne left a profound impression on contemporary chroniclers who recorded the sheer terror of the event. Alcuin, a scholar from Northumbria, one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England, wrote that never before had such terror appeared in Britain as they had just suffered from a pagan race. These pagans poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God. In reality, this was not the first raid the Vikings had launched against Britain or continental Europe. However, the impact of the Lindisfarne raid was immense. Because it was a Christian monastery, the incident forced many Europeans to take the threat posed by these pagans seriously. Furthermore, since monks were the primary chroniclers of that era, it is understandable why they emphasized the gravity of the Lindisfarne tragedy. In the 9th century, the Vikings began to stream in to raid and invade the kingdoms of Britain, most of which belonged to the Anglo-Saxons. Gradually, these attacks became larger and more organized. Viking armies even began overwintering instead of returning home after their raids. Not only the kingdoms in England, but Ireland and Scotland were no exceptions. as these lands suffered heavy losses from Viking incursions. The situation grew so dire that the Vikings went beyond mere looting to overthrowing the rulers of the Picts and Dalriada in Scotland. Following the collapse of the Pictish kingdom, the Vikings spread out to conquer Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides, establishing territories ruled by Viking earls. This expansionist process continued throughout the subsequent decades of the 9th century. Similarly, in Ireland, in 853, a Viking leader named Olaf became the first king of Dublin, a city developed from fortified ports established by the Vikings decades prior. Ruling alongside his brothers Ivar and Awisel, he waged continuous warfare against the native population. Over the next several decades, conflicts persisted between the locals and the Viking invaders. Starting in 866, the forces of the Irish king, Flann Sinna, began to counterattack, successfully burning down key ports of the invaders. Although he passed away in 879, the wars against the Vikings in Ireland did not cease. By the early 10th century, the Irish finally succeeded in expelling the invaders. However, the Vikings did not give up this land easily. They returned to attack in 914, campaigning for 8 consecutive years and securing several critical victories. Major settlements in Waterford, Wexford, and Limerick were established. Over time, these towns grew, and Dublin eventually became the largest slave trade port in Europe at the time. The Vikings here were gradually assimilated, blending into a hybrid population in Ireland known as the Norse Gaels. In 865, a landmark event occurred when a massive army led by Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson invaded the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of East Anglia in Britain. These two figures were believed to be the sons of the legendary Viking king, Ragnar Lothbrok. This force later became known as the Great Heathen Army. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army completely shifted the Viking strategy up to that point. Before then, their campaigns consisted mainly of small to medium-scale raids. It was rare for disparate Viking groups to unite into a large army. However, their triumphs starting in 865 demonstrated that the Vikings were now prepared to mobilize massive armies capable of seizing land in England and transforming them into colonies. Numerous Anglo-Saxon territories fell to the Vikings, becoming the Danelaw, the region under Viking control. In 870, a massive army under the command of the Viking leader Bagsec landed in Britain with the intention of conquering the entire kingdom of Wessex. However, Wessex stood firm under the leadership of King Alfred of Wessex. In the Battle of Ashdown in 871, the West Saxon army successfully repelled the massive Viking force and slew Bagsec. During the final years of the 9th century, warfare between the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Vikings grew intense. An alliance formed between the Welsh and the Kingdom of Mercia successfully pushed back the Vikings. By 947, although the Vikings briefly recaptured York, it was a minor victory because Viking forces in Britain had greatly weakened. They could only maintain small settlements and lacked the capacity for long-term military campaigns. In 1013, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard invaded England and declared himself King of England. Following Sweyn's death, his successor, Knut, he spent nearly the next 20 years campaigning and expanding his territory. Throughout his reign, Knut endeavored to reconcile the peoples of England with the Danes, a highly novel approach at the time. Military victories allowed Knut to gain control over Norway and parts of Sweden. Knut's realm became known as the North Sea Empire, encompassing most of England, Denmark, Norway, and a small part of Sweden. However, shortly after Canute passed away in 1035, the North Sea Empire weakened and finally dissolved in 1042. Viking power in England gradually waned, ultimately vanishing entirely after the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. The inhabitants of Eastern Europe often referred to the Vikings as Varangians or Variags. These Vikings mostly came from Sweden during major migrations. Viking activity in Eastern Europe centered primarily around trade and raiding along major river systems and the Caspian Sea. Some elite warriors were even hired by the Byzantine Empire to serve as the emperor's personal Varangian guard. According to Russian chronicles, they established tributary systems over the Slavic and Finnic tribes in Eastern Europe. The chaotic state of the region provided an ideal opportunity for the Varangians to establish formal rule. RUNIC, a Varangian chieftain, became the conqueror who established the historically significant Russian city of Novgorod. Over time, they gradually developed trade routes stretching from the Volga River down to Greece and the Middle East. The Vikings established major trading centers such as Ladoga, Gnezdovo, and Gotland. Eventually, the Vikings in these areas were assimilated, and by the 11th century, they had effectively integrated into the native populations of Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, in Central Europe, major settlements were built along the southern shores of the Baltic Sea for trading purposes, developing alongside the settlement of coastal Slavic populations. Ancient documents and archaeological remains indicate significant cultural and technical exchange between the Scandinavians and the Slavs. They shared shipbuilding techniques and established major trading and settlement hubs such as Rerik, Dierkov, and Wollin. However, many of these sites were gradually abandoned and fell into decline as inhabitants departed due to economic competition or the ravages of war. In the region around the Rhine and the Low Countries regarded today as the heart of European power, the Vikings frequently invaded and plundered starting from the 9th century. However, to the west of the Rhine, a power existed that actively sought to curb Viking influence. This was the Carolingian dynasty, descendants of Charlemagne. They ruled the Carolingian Empire, a Frankish realm established by Charlemagne. The core territory of this empire was Francia, which later became France, but it also encompassed northern Italy, several Germanic lands to the west, the Low Countries, and a small part of the Iberian Peninsula. They proved to be the most stubborn adversaries of the Vikings in Europe. The Vikings began attacking this region in the final decade of the 8th century. Initially conducted during the summer, these attacks primarily targeted monasteries for plunder. After Charlemagne and his successor, Louis the Pious, passed away, the Carolingian Empire fell into civil war and grew weak. In 841, exploiting the internal chaos, the Vikings swept in to invade and plunder, establishing their first colony in Gascony in southwestern France. By 845, the Vikings grew even bolder, sailing down the Seine River to lay siege to Paris. They attacked and plundered Paris and its surrounding areas for many years. The Carolingian Empire continued to fracture, eventually dividing into 3 smaller kingdoms: West Francia, Middle Francia, and East Francia. In the years 885 and 886, Odo, the Count of Paris and later King of West Francia, successfully defended the city multiple times against Viking onslaughts. In 911, the Viking leader Rollo was defeated at Chartres, but subsequently reached an agreement with the King of West Francia. Under this treaty, the Duchy of Normandy was established, and Rollo became its first duke. In return, Rollo agreed to convert to Christianity and pledged to protect West Francia from other Viking raids. The assimilation process was highly successful. The Normans, descendants of the Vikings in Normandy, would go on to play a monumental role in European history. Viking footprints also reached southern Europe, extending as far as the Iberian Peninsula. In 842, the Vikings established a base at the mouth of the Loire River, using it as a stepping stone to launch attacks on the peninsula and gain entry into the Mediterranean. Major campaigns took place in the following years. The first Viking attack targeted Al-Andalus, the Muslim-ruled region of the Iberian Peninsula. A Viking fleet of 60 to 80 ships raided Galicia, then sailed upriver to occupy Seville for several weeks. However, the Muslim forces of Al-Andalus quickly counterattacked and defeated the Vikings on land, forcing them to retreat. On another front, the Vikings attempted to navigate the Tagus River to strike Lisbon, but this assault failed, and they were repelled. Following these incursions, the Muslims in Iberia resolved to build up their navy and organize local defenses to counter the Viking threat. Nonetheless, the Vikings did not give up. In 859, they mobilized a large force to attack Al-Andalus once more, continuously plundering along the peninsula's coastline. These raids severely disrupted trade, forcing residents to flee cities while rural areas suffered extensive damage. Even so, the Muslims continued their counteroffensives, and the Vikings retaliated with a series of raids around Pamplona. Viking fleets continued to raid the Iberian Peninsula through the beginning of the 11th century. Further away lay Italy, which fortunately suffered fewer incursions due to natural geographical barriers. Nevertheless, around the mid-10th century, two Viking leaders, Bjorn Ironside and Hastein, embarked on a long expedition that sailed around the Iberian Peninsula and entered the Mediterranean. They attacked and plundered Luna, mistaking it for Rome. Afterward, they returned to the Iberian Peninsula to raid. These Vikings repeatedly clashed with Muslim forces in the region, yet they managed to secure several victories, even raiding the port of Luni, sailing around Tuscany to reach Arno, plundering Pisa, and marching on the town of Fiesole near Florence. Not confined to a single continent, the Vikings also established settlements along the southwestern coast of Greenland. Thanks to a favorable climate, they were able to survive there by raising livestock across several eras, with various settlements emerging over time. However, the most fascinating discovery made by the Vikings was North America. They crossed the Atlantic Ocean to establish settlements in what is now Newfoundland, colonizing the area for a brief period. Nonetheless, severe logistical vulnerabilities prevented them from sustaining the population in these colonies. As a result, these Viking settlements in North America quickly declined and vanished within a few decades. Famous figures of the Viking Age: Harold, Bluetooth Harold, nicknamed Bluetooth, was a Viking king who ruled Denmark and Norway in the 10th century. Harold was a devout convert to Christianity and spent many years propagating the religion throughout his kingdom, while consistently conducting peace negotiations. According to many scholars, the origin of his nickname, Bluetooth, comes from a dead tooth that appeared dark blue or black. If this sounds familiar, that is because his nickname was later used to name the short-range wireless communication and data transfer technology we know as Bluetooth. Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar Lothbrok is perhaps the most famous Viking in popular culture, largely thanks to the television series Vikings on the History Channel. Ragnar is generally regarded as a legendary figure rather than a strictly historical one. as his character is a composite of several different historical personalities. Consequently, it is difficult today to determine who the real historical Ragnar actually was. We can only be certain of a few things. Ragnar was a formidable commander on the battlefield, a king of Denmark and Sweden, and one of the first Viking leaders to conceive of invading Britain rather than merely raiding it. Similar to Gilgamesh or Alexander the Great, Ragnar was mythologized, with numerous poems recounting his heroic exploits, such as slaying a dragon to rescue his wife. His epithet, Lothbrok, which translates to hairy breeches, originated from a tale in which he wore pitch-dipped, flame-resistant leather pants. In a similar vein, his death is widely considered the main catalyst for the great heathen army's invasion of Britain. Following Ragnar's execution, where he was thrown into a pit of vipers by King Eoya of Northumbria, his sons, Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Ubba, united with their allies to launch an all-out invasion of Britain. Eric the Victorious Eric was a Viking king who ruled Sweden from 970 to 995. According to legend, he defeated his nephew, Styrbjörn the Strong, at the Battle of Fyrisvellir near Uppsala. He was rumored to have received the favor of Odin, the chief god in Norse mythology, which served as the origin of his epithet, the Victorious. Bjorn Ironside. According to legend, he was the first king of the House of Munso, the founding dynasty of Sweden, and one of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Alongside his brothers, he continued the path of plundering and conquest carved out by their father. He was one of the key commanders of the great heathen army, spending much of his time in military campaigns against the Anglo-Saxons during the second half of the 9th century. Sweyn Forkbeard. Sweyn Forkbeard was a powerful Viking king who seized the throne of Denmark in 986 following a bloody conflict with his father, Harald Bluetooth. Sweyn subsequently allied with Eric Håkonsson and Olaf Skjøtkonung of Sweden. Their coalition defeated the Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason at the Battle of Svolder in the year 1000, marking the initial steps of his conquest of Norway. From 1002, Sweyn led multiple raiding expeditions to Britain, and by 1013, he had conquered the region, laying the foundation for the future North Sea Empire. The catalyst for this invasion was the St. Brice's Day Massacre, a slaughter of Danes ordered by King Aethelred. After defeating Aethelred, Sweyn Forkbeard passed away just 5 weeks later. In February of 1014, Knut the Great was one of the most powerful Viking kings of his era. The son of Sweyn Forkbeard, he inherited the strong foundation laid by his father and built a formidable Viking empire. Knut's domain encompassed Denmark, Norway, most of Britain, and a portion of Sweden, which history would later refer to as the North Sea Empire. After King Sweyn passed away in 1014, Canute was proclaimed King of England by his father's Danish army. However, the English nobility continued to support Edmund Ironside, forcing Sinet to retreat to Denmark. In 1015, Canute led more than 10,000 Viking troops to land in Wessex in the south, subsequently marching north into Northumbria and laying siege to London. Following the decisive Battle of Asandun, the English were defeated by the Danish forces. Upon the death of King Edmund in 1016, Canute became the sole ruler of England. As a decisive and ruthless king, Canute purged his political rivals. Once his throne was secure, he divided England into 4 administrative earldoms, which established the administrative framework of England for centuries to come. He also began recruiting both Scandinavians and Englishmen into his service. The young king also devoted significant time to defending the English coast against other Viking raiders. Following the death of his brother, King Harald II of Denmark, in 1018, Canute became the ruler of both Denmark and Norway. However, his reign was far from peaceful, as many Norwegians and Swedes grew resentful of Canut's expanding power. While the Danish population was displeased by his spending far more time in England than in Denmark, in 1026, Canute departed England and defeated the Swedish and Norwegian coalition at the Battle of Helgo. Not only did he secure his throne, but he also counterattacked in Norway by sowing discord between the Norwegian people and their king, ultimately driving the Norwegian monarch from his realm. In 1027, Canute traveled to Rome to attend the coronation of Conrad II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Following this event, Canute declared himself King of England, Denmark, Norway, and some of the Swedes. This was a highly significant event, demonstrating not only Canute's ability to engage peacefully with other European powers, but also his intent to project himself as a Christian monarch dedicated to protecting the Church. To this day, it remains unclear whether this was a genuine religious conversion or purely a political maneuver. However, surviving records make it difficult to claim Canute was hostile to Christianity. He maintained warm relations with Emperor Conrad II, repaired and constructed numerous monasteries, and facilitated pilgrimages for English subjects to Rome. Despite this, the Danish-born king continued to show respect to those adhering to Norse paganism within his lands. Canute passed away in 1035, and his death precipitated the decline and ultimate collapse of the North Sea Empire in 1042. Ivar the Boneless. Ivar the Boneless was one of the most prominent and enigmatic Viking leaders of the 9th century. According to Norse sagas and Anglo-Saxon chronicles, Ivar was one of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok and the seeress Aslag, and served as a key commander of the great heathen army. Ivar was renowned for his sharp intellect, tactical brilliance, and sheer ruthlessness, particularly during his campaign of vengeance against the King of Northumbria for the death of Ragnar Lothbrok. After capturing York in 867, Ivar, alongside his brothers, including Ubba and Halfdan, expanded Viking-controlled territory, laying the groundwork for the region known as the Danelaw. His moniker, the Boneless, has several interpretations. It could refer to a congenital brittle bone condition, a metaphor for unusual flexibility, or a translation error over time. Ivar may also be the historical figure Imar recorded in Irish annals, who established the Norse Gaelic Viking dynasty in Dublin. He passed away around 873, leaving a legacy as one of the most influential Vikings in early medieval Britain. Rollo the Walker Rollo, also known as Rollo the Walker, became the first Duke of Normandy after reaching a treaty with West Francia to establish the Duchy of Normandy in 911. Prior to this, Rollo had led forces to besiege Paris in 885. Following more than 20 years of campaigning, Rollo secured his dominion by gaining control of the land surrounding the lower Seine River. Despite suffering a defeat against West Francian forces at the Battle of Chartres, Rollo managed to maintain his territorial rights. Rollo ruled the newly established Duchy of Normandy until his death in 930. His descendants held this title until Normandy was annexed by France in the 13th century. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, the end of the Viking Age. The Viking Age is widely recognized to have begun with the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of England, and it was in England that the event marking its end would unfold. For hundreds of years, numerous small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms existed across Britain. By the late 9th century, the southern kingdom of Wessex gradually rose to become the dominant power. In 886, King Alfred recaptured London from the Vikings and declared himself King of the Anglo-Saxons. Through the subsequent reigns of Edward the Elder and Athelstan, Wessex conquered and annexed other kingdoms. In 927, King Athelstan seized the final Viking-controlled territory in England, which was York, making him the first Anglo-Saxon king to rule the entirety of England. The lineage of Anglo-Saxon kings was briefly interrupted by Viking monarchs. However, after the death of King Harthacnut, a son of Canute the Great, in 1042, the rule of England returned to the Anglo-Saxons with the ascension of King Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor passed away in 1066 without leaving an heir, triggering a succession crisis. The throne was initially granted to Harold Godwinson, Edward's brother-in-law. However, rival claimants remained, including Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, who had previously been promised the English throne by King Harthacnut. Additionally, there was William of Normandy, also known as William the Bastard, a distant relative of Edward. Leveraging their respective military might, both contenders began assembling armies to seize the English crown. Harald Hardrada assembled a fleet of approximately 200 to 300 ships, landing in England with a force of 7,000 to 9,000 troops. In September of 1066, Harold captured York after defeating a smaller force led by English nobles, after which the Vikings received submissions and hostages from the city. The situation initially favored Harold, as Harold Godwinson was stationed far to the south to defend against an expected invasion by William of Normandy. However, upon receiving news of York's fall, Harold Godwinson immediately marched his army north at breakneck speed to confront Hardrada's forces. The two armies clashed at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066. The sudden appearance of the English army caught the Vikings completely by surprise. Due to the unseasonably warm September weather, many warriors had left their armor behind at their camp. Consequently, they faced a severe disadvantage as their army was divided. The English launched a rapid assault, easily overcoming and eliminating the Vikings who remained on the western bank of the river, leaving most dead or in full retreat. The English army pressed forward but encountered a bottleneck at the bridge. This delay gave the Norwegian forces precious time to form a protective shield wall. Once across the bridge, the English quickly deployed their formations and assaulted the enemy. Both sides fought fiercely for several hours, but the Norwegians gradually succumbed to their disadvantage due to their lack of armor. Ultimately, the Norwegian shield wall broke, and they were defeated by the English forces. Following the death of Harald Hardrada on the battlefield, the Norwegian army withdrew completely. As for Harold Godwinson, although victorious over the Norwegians, he lost his own life just nearly 3 weeks later at the Battle of Hastings while fighting the forces of William of Normandy, after which the rule of England fell to the Normans. The death of Harald Hardrada was not merely the passing of a Viking king, it marked the moment the Vikings lost any prospect of reviving their former golden age. Though minor Viking raids in England and Scotland would persist in subsequent centuries, they would never again pose a major existential threat as they had in the past. The Viking era drew to a definitive close following the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066.